Hidden Gems, Episode 0, all about us. Welcome to Hidden Gems, a board game podcast where we review unusual, forgotten, and underappreciated board games. We're your hosts. My name is Chris.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Cameron. Thanks for listening to our show. So, before we begin, how does everybody feel? It's pretty exciting, right?
I'm excited, and I'm wondering how long it's going to take for me to get used to having this microphone in my face.
Yeah.
It is a weird, surreal feeling for sure. After listening to podcasts for so long and doing one, it's going to take a little bit getting used to, but I'm excited.
Yeah.
It is definitely strange. I think I'm going to have to adjust to hearing my own voice in recordings. I think that's going to be the
I'm just
hardest
glad
thing
that we
for me.
worked out the microphone
That
placement.
beautiful baritone voice.
Yeah. I'm so glad we worked out the microphone placement so we can actually like make eye contact.
Exactly.
It feels nice.
Yeah, during our testing session, I was joking with Jason that he reminded me of Wilson from Home Improvement because I could just like see his eyes, and I was like, I cannot work like this.
Yeah.
If I cannot see at least 2/3 of your face, it's just a little bit bizarre.
You'll never know what I'm thinking.
That's exactly right. I don't know what you're thinking anyways, most of the time.
Okay, so before we get started, we want to make a disclaimer. We won't actually be reviewing any games in this episode. However, we have already released episode 1, where we'll be reviewing our first triad of games.
Yep.
Just got some really fun stuff lined up for you on that in that episode. So if you want, go ahead and charge ahead to episode 1. Don't feel like you have to listen to this one. However, if you want to hear more about why we're making this podcast, who we are, how we got into gaming, what our families are like, kind of more about us as your hosts, we invite you to listen to this episode.
Yes.
It should be a lot of fun.
That's what this is for.
So, Chris, you're kind of we've been calling you like the founder of the podcast.
I consider us all founders, but I appreciate you saying that.
But you've been the guy over the years that has gotten us together, and you kind of came up with the idea of like, hey, maybe we should make a podcast. Well, I'm sure people will hear about the size and magnitude of your game collection later on, but you're the guy that gets everybody together in our gaming community, and so kind of you're the point person for the podcast. So I kind of want to direct the first question to you. Why would you say we're starting this podcast?
For sure, yeah. So obviously we're blessed with a really large game group. So I would say if everybody actually showed up, which never happens, but if it were to happen, we would probably have 30 to 35 guys here on any given night. We have a really large circle of guys who are really interested in board games. And I think what is unique about our group, especially about the guys that are in here in particular, which is why I wanted you to join me on this podcast journey, and not just because y'all are some of my best friends, but also because you guys like to talk about games. It's not uncommon at all for us to have really long discussions about board games after we play them, kind of like the post-game breakdown. We actually had one just a couple of nights ago on a game that we're going to review on here in a few episodes. But we do that often, right? So we have guys in our group that like to talk about games. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should make a podcast, though. And I think we should make it clear that there are a lot of podcasts available to listen on board games. Many. So I've been in the hobby since about 2012. I consume a lot of board game media, and there are a bunch of podcasts. However, there aren't a lot of podcasts. Actually, I can't even really think of one that does what we're going to do, and that's looking at board games that are a little bit more under the radar and underappreciated, or just kind of got missed. There are lots of board game podcasts that talk about Terraforming Mars, that talk about Gloomhaven, that talk about Azul, and all those are great games. And this is another thing I want to make.
They're fantastic games.
Awesome games.
I mean,
Love them.
we've invested, I don't know how many hours in Gloomhaven. I mean, we have a Gloomhaven campaign that you, me, and Brandon are playing, and like they're incredible games. There's a reason that they have the reputation that they have, right?
Yep.
So it's this, I think, my take on why we're doing a podcast is not so much that we have something to offer about games that everyone loves already. No one needs to hear us talk about those games. But when you started talking about this podcast, like it was, okay, there's a lot of games out there that maybe people aren't talking about, and maybe they're not even playing. And that was a concern that seemed like that you wanted to address.
Definitely.
So what would you say this podcast is about?
Yeah, for sure. So, and before I answer that question, just because this is something I was a little bit worried about with this podcast, is I didn't want this podcast to come across as like the hipsters board game podcast. Right. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Oh, you play Terraforming Mars like everybody else. You know, like we think those are good games.
Like, we love those games, and
they're great.
They hit our table often.
Yeah.
Trust us, we're not cool enough to be hipsters.
we're not. So what we want to do is, just our mission statement is to highlight unusual, underappreciated, and forgotten board games. Okay, so that's kind of like, we feel like encompasses all the board games that we want to talk about on this podcast.
Yeah. So let's maybe break that down a little bit more, right? Okay, so you use kind of 3 keywords: unusual, forgotten, underappreciated. Walk us through unusual.
Definitely, yeah. So, like I said, I've been in board game hobby since about 2012. So I've seen a lot of games, I've experienced a lot of games, and I've noticed that for whatever reason, games that tend to fall outside of the mold of like your typical type of board game, like your typical worker placement game, your typical area control game, for whatever reason, tend to fall by the wayside and not always, but a lot of times just don't gain traction like those games do. And when I say unusual, I mean games that have just like really unique mechanisms that you've just never seen in any other game before. For whatever reason, games that have interesting and are unusual or never seen before mechanics, sometimes they just kind of get missed or lost in the shuffle.
Right. So let's talk about forgotten. Mm-hmm. We're focusing on forgotten games. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so this was one category of games that I went back and forth in my own mind as to whether we would include them in the show, because if you're listening to this podcast and you enjoy this podcast, some of the games that we're talking about, if you've been in the hobby for a while, you might think, I wouldn't consider that a hidden gem, right? Right. Because when it came out like 2005, it was more well-known than it is now. And I'm not talking about stuff like Dominion and Ticket to Ride. Obviously, those still stand the test of time. Everybody knows what those are.
You played it, but maybe like it's just kind of old now.
Exactly.
Like you're more interested in something that's newer.
I don't want to give anything away for future episodes, but we're definitely playing games that, let me just say this, since I got into the hobby in 2012, I know from what I've read on Board Game Media, they're respected games, but I never hear anybody talk about them, like ever. They're just not discussed, and some of them from pretty prominent designers that they've just gotten forgotten in the mix. And so I think, board gaming, I think, saw a real push for people entering the hobby around when we got into it, around 2012, 2013. And so I think since it kind of exploded at that point, there are a lot of people that just don't know about these older games, which really deserve play and are really pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, for a lot of those folks who haven't been in the hobby as long, like this will be a good introduction to some of those older games that were really well known at the time.
Yep, for sure. Yeah,
and I could see that being kind of the beauty of like once a game has been invented and once it's been released and enjoyed by the community, like I think we, just by virtue of how large our own gaming community is, we've introduced a lot of people to the board game community, right? We have all these friends that I think are in our community now who we originally had this casual conversation with that we're like, oh, do you like board games? And they're like, oh yeah, I like board games like Settlers of Catan. And we're like, oh friend.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah, the waters are way deeper than you realize. And they're like, oh really? Tell me more. And like, oh, come on Thursday,
Right.
And then they come in here and they see your collection and they're like, I had no idea that there were so many board games that weren't made by, Mattel or whatever. Like,
yeah.
So
yeah. I think for me, one of the biggest selling points when you introduced us to this podcast idea was that I know I personally really enjoy finding unique or interesting things that no one else has ever heard of and introducing them to people, right? Whether it's a TV show, a movie, maybe. But so when you mentioned that as being the driving factor behind this podcast, I was like, I'm in, sign me up, right? Because I love the search. Going
you
after
immediately started going through Board Game Geek at like very obscure.
I did. That'll probably get discussed more in later episodes.
Oh, we
of the
will
podcast.
talk more about that because it's fascinating to me how you data mined Board Game Geek.
Oh yes,
and just like took over their website, and I don't even. You'll explain it.
I've geeked out a bit.
Yeah,
I'll admit.
So the last category that we talk about in our mission statement. So we've talked about unusual, we've talked about forgotten. The last one is underappreciated. So when we think about underappreciated, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so this one just pretty much catches everything else, right? These are games can't really explain, why they didn't catch on. And now a reason why they maybe didn't catch on is because they're just not good, right? I mean, there's always that chance, right? But we're trying to find games that are good that just for whatever reason just got missed. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're old, right? Just games that came out in the last 2, 3, or 4 years. And for whatever reason, maybe they got released at the same time as another big game or a big influx of games and they just got totally lost in the shuffle. But they are just forgotten.
Okay. Yeah, with the growing popularity of the hobby, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, but I would imagine there's hundreds of board games being released every year now. And it's impossible for even the many podcasts out there that review the new stuff to cover all of that, right? Yeah. So not every game is going to get the same degree of exposure. So hopefully we can bring that exposure to some of these good games. Yeah,
one of the things that I've observed as we've been preparing to make this podcast and have been playtesting games is that here's a designer that is pretty prolific, right? They have a couple of really popular titles under their belt. And one of the sort of lines of thinking that we take is well, let's go to their other games, right? Mm-hmm. If they're a good designer, if they're Stefan Feld, maybe they made more games that aren't super duper popular and widely played. Let's go to their other repertoire. And there are people that have made so many games. Mm-hmm. It's unreal how many games some of these designers have created and released that just, like I said, they fall into this underappreciated category. Maybe they're a quick game, they're a pretty simple rule set, and they just, for whatever reason, they're just kind of down the list on this maker's accolades. And we give them a try and feature them on the podcast, right? Because turns out they're kind of interesting at the very least.
Yeah. They may not always be good.
Sure.
But worth trying.
That's an important distinction to make. We're on a journey. We're on an adventure here to find good games. So, it would be a boring podcast if we only ever featured the best ones that we've found, right? I think that adventure and exploring some that are maybe not quite as fun. But there was an adventure and a fun time figuring it out along the way.
This game might be 8,000 in BGG ratings for a reason.
Yes.
But sometimes you find games that low that you're like, why is this game so low?
Yep. So sometimes we might have games featured on the podcast that we just kind of commit to them. And we say they're going to be in an episode. We're going to play test them. We're going to play test them at different player counts. We're going to play test them with different friends in our community. And they're in the podcast episode, and the verdict is going to the verdict's going to be what the verdict is going to be unapologetically. And it may be universally negative, it may be overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the fun. Mm-hmm. And there may be mixed reviews, right? And I think I want to highlight this right out of the gate, just because I'm kind of the person that comes to game night, and I frequently we're playing new games, and we get done with the game, and Chris is over the moon, this is a great game, I love it, it's fantastic, this is so unique and interesting, and Jason's over here going, I don't know.
Yeah, I balance out the equation.
That's right.
Very well. I've never met a game I didn't that's not true. I was going to say I never met a game I didn't like a little bit once, but we're going to review a couple that
Chris will never play a game once.
I always give him a chance.
Yeah, Chris will never play a game once and immediately just dump on a game.
Hey, no. I have to play it at least more than once. So.
That's true.
I'm fair,
but we already know how you feel after that first.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that for sure.
Yeah, Jason is good for this podcast for sure, because he kind of brings me back down to earth sometimes when I kind of go over the moon for a game, and helps me see that maybe it's not as perfect as I thought it was. But that's good reviewing, in my opinion. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Let's maybe take a moment to just talk about ourselves a little bit more generally.
Yep.
So let's just jump to Jason. So Jason, what do you do for a living? Where are you from? Do you have a family? Tell us about yourself.
Yeah. So I'm from Pennsylvania originally. Came down to North Carolina. We're North Carolina based. I guess we didn't explain that yet. We're based out of Raleigh. And I came down to go to school at UNC Chapel Hill. Boo. Yeah. We have a Duke alum in the room as well. But, somehow we agree on a lot of things.
On board games.
On board games, at least. Yeah. So I came here to go to school. Met my wife here. Stuck around, got a job. I'm a computer science major. I'm a geek through and through. So I work for a software company. I'm a software engineer. I've gone through a bunch of different roles in that industry. And yeah, I love all things technology and nerdiness. So I do have a family. I mentioned my wife, Jenny. She is not quite as much of a board gamer as me, but she has a lot of colorful commentary on our gaming habits. So she will definitely be featured on an episode at some point.
We'll see.
She's a lot of fun. So
I can't make any guarantees.
And then I have 3 kids. So I have a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And actually my oldest 2 really are getting a lot more into board games recently. So I've started introducing them to some. My oldest is, I don't know if he's a glutton for punishment or if he's just that into the hobby already, but I've taught him some pretty complex games already, and he loves it.
Age.
So
yeah. I mean, he's begging to come into game nights, from what I understand.
he is. So we'll get him out here eventually.
It won't be long.
He'll be a guest on the podcast, I'm sure.
There
as
you
well.
go.
So, but yeah, I love all things board gaming, technology. Do a lot of camping and hiking, woodworking, bourbon. All kinds of things. So
yes.
That's a little bit about me. I think we'll talk more about how we got into gaming later, so we'll come back to that.
Sure, yeah. All right, yeah. So I'll take a second to talk about myself. My name is Cameron. I'm originally from Eastern North Carolina, and I've been here in Raleigh actually for like 10 years now, which is a little over 10 years, which is kind of crazy to think.
Flies.
Let's see, work-wise, I am also a software engineer. I've been doing that since, I was 15 years old. It's like half my life. It's pretty crazy. I am married to Casey, my lovely wife, and we actually got married right in April, right at the beginning of the pandemic. So it's been a wild ride, but I love her to death. And we are very much looking forward to our honeymoon, actually, a year later when we can actually
Whenever
travel.
That can happen.
Exactly.
Thanks, COVID.
Yeah. Thanks, COVID. Yeah. So I'm definitely, I enjoy board games. I've been into that for a good while, which we'll talk about a little bit later. My other hobbies, I enjoy video games. I'm into woodworking. And I've recently renovated a home. That was kind of like a very all-consuming hobby for about a year of my life. I actually play a kind of a unique instrument.
I was going to say, if you don't mention uilleann pipes, I'm going to bring it up.
I play the uilleann bagpipes.
Are you going to play them on the show at
I'm
some
not
point?
particularly good.
I'd say you're pretty good.
I've been playing the saxophone since I was like 12, and they're very similarly keyed and fingered and so forth. So I picked that up about 2 or 3 years ago. I'm actually anticipating going to Ireland in December of this year.
Yep.
I put a set on order with a pipe maker out there in Northern Ireland like 3 years ago. So my goal is to be worthy of the instrument that the guy's making for me.
Yeah.
So that kind of rounds out, I think, my hobbies. But yeah, most recently it's been woodworking. I'm working on building out my shop right now. So yeah, that kind of covers me. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, so I'm also from North Carolina. So I was born and raised in a place called Fairview, North Carolina, which is a really small town. You've probably never heard of it. It's just east of Asheville in western North Carolina. That's where I grew up. Loved it. Love Asheville. It was an awesome place to grow up and live. Really enjoyed it. So much so that I went to college very close to there. So I went to Mars Hill College, which is a really small private liberal arts school in western North Carolina. About 1,400 students, so super small. Great for me. Loved it there. Would do it again. Got a great education and met my wife there, Talia, who was a fashion and interior design major. We started dating in my senior year. I was pre-med, committed to going to medical school at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, Tennessee, and we fell in love. She followed me up there. We got married shortly after, and it's been great. We have 4 kids. I have to think about this, make sure I get this right on air. 4 boys, 14, 12, 10, and 8.
Oh my gosh, it's so crazy to think that
I know, right?
The youngest is 8 now.
Yeah, when we moved to Raleigh, around the time that we met, we just had Bryce and Kale.
Oh, yeah, that's
my
right.
oldest 2,
Right.
so it's just crazy how time flies. But yeah, boys are awesome. I love them. They're huge esports nerds. They just love video games. They all play on competitive gaming teams. Something called XP League that actually started here in Raleigh, but it's nationwide. They play teams from California, let's see, Hanover. That's Massachusetts, right? Pennsylvania.
I think there's a Hanover in multiple states.
There's probably. It's the big one. Whatever the big one is. Teams from Texas, all over the country, right? So They play Fortnite. They play Overwatch. My oldest son, he plays Valorant. He's really into it. So
You even did a
It's
stint of
super
coaching,
good.
huh?
what's that?
You even did a stint of coaching.
I did. I coached my youngest kid's Overwatch team because I understand it at least a little bit.
There you go.
I did not coach my oldest son's Overwatch team because he wouldn't have listened to me anyway. And to be quite honest, they were too good for me. But
Of course, we haven't gotten Hayes to back away more than like 10 inches from the TV screen.
as he's slaying people at 8
That's
years
right.
old.
That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah, no, they did really well. So Bryce's team actually finished second in the nation in their league for Overwatch. Actually lost that team from Hanover, but it was really fun to watch. So that's a little bit about my family, what I do for a living. So like I said, I went to medical school, East Tennessee State University. I thought I wanted to be a pediatrician, and then I spent about a week in peds clinic, and I was like, nope. And I love kids, right? I have 4 of my own.
Right.
But having kids and playing with kids and working with kids in a hospital setting are 2 very different things. And pediatricians, it's an admirable field. I'm not criticizing it. It just wasn't for me. It stressed me out. It was just too much for me. So I went through a period where I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, did a rotation in the laboratory of all things, and fell in love with it. So I'm actually a pathologist. I'm one of those doctors that's more behind the scenes that you're never going to see. I'm the one that renders all the diagnoses, mostly cancer diagnoses, unfortunately, but that is what I do. Looking at glass, looking at tumors, things like that. And that's what brought me here to Raleigh in 2008 because I did my residency at Duke University and then stayed on.
Boo.
Stayed on as part faculty and also working at the VA in Durham.
So the staying on thing, I think, is a good way to transition to the next thing I think we want to talk about, which is like, how do we know each other? I think probably maybe some of our listeners are like, okay, here's 3 dudes. Like, how do they know each other? They're just like drinking buddies. So let's talk about that. I actually met Chris on a mission trip through our church in 2011. It turns out we were going to Denver. We were going to do some cool stuff to kind of help the city, help this church plant out there, just bless the city, do some community service type things. And I happen to know some of the people that lived out there. So I went out there by myself, not through the church mission trip proper, but you were leading the church mission trip.
Mm-hmm. Me and Talia.
That's right. You and Talia were leading the church mission trip. And then I sort of just met up with you and was like, hey, I'm here and I'm going to help out with whatever I can.
I didn't even know you were going to be there.
That's right.
I was like, who is this guy?
Yeah, who's this dude that's
He's
just
not
like
on my
hanging
team.
out with us?
I don't think I knew this story. So
Oh yeah.
I'm interested.
This is Chris and I's like origin story.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're like hanging out in Denver doing, community service.
Yeah.
And then we had like a day. I feel like we had a day that we went out to like Estes Park
We
or
did,
something
yeah.
like
We went
that.
to Estes Park, yeah.
We were like hiking and whatever. And somehow, I don't know, some type of gaming or something just came up and we had this moment where like, oh yeah, like when we get back to Raleigh, when we get back home, we'll just hang out sometime.
Yeah.
And I don't remember what we played. We did something.
Well,
Video games or board games?
No, it was board games, I
yeah.
think. So I think what we were talking about, so when I moved to Raleigh, I started getting into the D20 system. I borrowed a board game from Bill Parrish, which was D&D Castle Ravenloft, actually.
Okay, yeah.
So, which is a board game.
Right.
It's a cooperative board game, but it's a co-op board game that uses the D20 system. And I remember my mind was just blown by this. Okay, so at this point, I had never been exposed to Dungeons & Dragons or rolling a D20 for an attack and rolling damage or any of that. Totally foreign to me. And so I was all about it. I was obsessed with it. So I was like inviting people to my house, that little townhouse we lived in on Rhiannon, to play Castle Ravenloft. And I think that's what I invited you over to play.
Yeah, we played the heck out of it.
Yeah, we did.
Which is funny that you mentioned that now because I do Audible and I just started listening to the Legend of Driss, the Crystal Shard by Ari Salvatore on Audible. We're not sponsored by Audible, but I do listen to books on Audible. And so it's funny because like I started, you learn about the characters, and I was like, but these names sound familiar, and it was like, oh yeah, they're the characters from Castle Ravenloft. So we started playing that game together, and that's led to kind of the construction of our gaming community, right?
It is. So we didn't jump to board games right away, and we'll flesh out a little bit more of our board game histories a little bit later, but I think it's worth jumping ahead a little bit here just to kind of explain our history, because this is where we've got super close, you and I.
Yeah, for sure.
So after Ravenloft, because, I mean, I know this is going to surprise you too, but I kind of have an addictive personality. When I get into something, I'm like all in on it.
Really?
Shocking. I know, right? So, like, I remember just like researching Dungeons and Dragons. So like
nerd.
That's right.
Well, we're just playing. This is in the background though. We're just like coming over once a week or something to play Dungeons and Dragons. Well, all the while you're researching actual D&D.
Well, so we're not playing. We're playing Ravenloft.
Sorry, Castle
which
Ravenloft,
is based off of the D20 system. So I buy the red box. Okay, so when we started playing, and I know some of the D&D players out there are going to cringe when they hear this, but at that time it was 4th edition, which we didn't know any better at the time, but it's a very controversial edition, and a lot of people hate it because it plays like a board game. Okay, it's very mechanical in its combat system, and so, but anyways, I was all excited about it. So I got the red box, I got all the like players' handbooks and stuff, and I just started learning how to play D&D. And so at that time, we had a group of people, Brian Spanner being one, who kind of had a little bit of a background in D&D. So he helped a lot because we were learning from scratch. And we just started playing D&D. And man, we played D&D all the time. And some of the best memories I've ever had in the gaming setting.
There was this one thing, though, that I distinctly remember about the transition, right? It was like we're over there one night, we're playing Castle Ravenloft, we like finished a module or whatever, and we're like wrapping up and everyone's about to go home, and you go, hey, so I don't really know how to say this, but do you guys want to try like real D&D? And like the four of us were just like, yeah, I think so. Because I mean, for me at least, like, you know, I grew up hearing about people playing D&D and it being this thing of like, you're going to hell.
It's satanic.
You know, it's summoning demons and stuff and like magical casting, you know, and then we actually started looking into it. And, you know, of course, like we're, you know, our background is we're Christian people. So we're like, okay, we're like very cautious about, you know, certain things. When we started looking into it, we're like, this sounds like a game.
This is Lord of the Rings. You're playing Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, it sounds like a game. And it's not demonic at all. So, so we actually, you know, I had a lot of conversations with my dad about this. But anyway, so we kind of pushed past some of the reputation that D&D had and really started doing it. And then we started our first campaign.
Yep.
I think we played maybe like
the red box.
That's right. We started with the red box, and that led to like a larger campaign.
Keep on the Borderlands.
That's right.
If you're familiar with 4th edition, it's the natural progression from the red box. It was a big campaign where you're like recruiting citizens.
And it's like Forgotten Realms setting and everything, right? And we played, I think, through maybe like level 7.
Yep.
And that was like and by that point, I think you ran the same campaign for 2 whole groups and had like a total of like 14 or 15
tons of
players involved. You
rotating
were running the same campaign for 2 different groups because we had so many people that wanted to play.
Super popular.
And a lot of those people were, I guess, through our church, probably. Mm-hmm. And maybe some other friends that were interested. And really that's kind of set the foundation for just regular gaming for us, right?
It did, yeah. And we won't talk too much about D&D, but I want to say that like some of my best memories ever are playing D&D. I mean, we had some epic adventures. Like,
oh yes,
White Plume Mountain.
Oh man,
sticks out in my mind.
Yes,
it's probably my all-time favorite.
Bluefield Stormdren.
Yeah, that's right. Such a good adventure. So I got to the point where I was rewriting classic 1st edition modules into 4th edition rules because I just got more comfortable with the system.
Right.
And we did that. Tomb of Horrors.
Yep.
And that's how we got Joe.
That's right.
Into D&D.
Were we still playing 4th edition when we did those?
Yes, we were.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
5th edition came out finally, and I think for me at least, it was a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
Because it was just so much less focused on combat and sort of rulesiness and so forth. And it kind of led for this more of like a theater of the mind thing, which led, and we could probably do a whole episode on just our experience with D&D.
What do you think about D&D, Jason?
You lost me at I have to use voices.
Yeah, that's right.
I think for me, you know, I I don't know at what point exactly in this history I entered in. I think at some point you guys transitioned over to playing more, Euro style standard board games. And at that point, I think I joined in the fray and started coming over to the townhouse, and you were doing stuff there. Cameron, I think you and I met earlier than that.
Yes.
Through a mutual acquaintance, I think, a friend of ours named Garrett. But yeah, I was actually trying to think about when I met you, and it took me a while to figure it out. But I think that's what it is.
Yeah, I feel like we probably crossed paths before then.
I'm sure
but that was maybe around the time that we really actually got to know each other. And by then, our community of like playing games regularly had been pretty well established. And I think that might actually, I feel like we would be remiss not to mention our like annual gathering, which I started going to it when it was like maybe like 13, 14, 15 people.
Yep.
Which swelled to like, what is it now? 30, 40 people.
A lot. Yeah.
Enough people that in a pandemic, we were like, yeah, we're going to delay until like most people have been vaccinated at least. So we didn't get to do it this year, unfortunately.
Sad.
It's usually around New Year's.
Yeah. We didn't get to do it this year.
We didn't get to do it yet. We do still intend to do it, but we're waiting until kind of like the greater portion of the community feels good about doing that. But yeah, and so as we mentioned that, we all get together around the beginning of the year for like, 3 nights? Something like that.
Yeah.
4 days, 3 nights. And everyone just brings as many games as they are can pack in their trunk. And we
Far
go
more
to
than
this
we actually
lodge,
have time to play.
Yeah.
And we
play like 10% of the games I bring.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
It's stupid.
But we're there. We've got maybe 4 or 5 games going on at a time, varying degrees of interest, nerdiness, and we'll say commitment level. Some people are playing lighter games. Some people are playing
throw burrito.
Yeah, some people are playing 3-hour games.
Foam burritos flying all over the room, knocking our game pieces all over the place.
That's right. And if we could say anything, if we could pitch anything to the greater gaming community, like figure out a way to get with your community for like extended periods of time, like at least once a year. It's an incredible amount of fun.
Yeah.
It's a great way to get to know your friends better and maybe people that you don't know in your gaming community better. We really benefit a lot from it. We get to know each other. It becomes this thing of like, at a point like, it's less about games. We're actually just enjoying being friends, which is one of the things that really drew me in, because I'm a pretty serious gamer, but like I'm not maybe like the most committed board gamer. I have
D&D
a small
is
collection.
your bigger love.
Probably, yeah. I have a very small collection of games at my home. I kind of only buy games when I know that like my family members or my immediate friends outside of my normal gaming group are going to play them. But yeah, get together with your gaming community for like extended periods of time if you can. It's a huge blessing. It's a great way to spend time with your friends, conversations. Hopefully, I think if you're doing it well, we'll kind of delve into more serious matters of life and friendship and stuff like that. Yeah. And that's really what the beauty of, for me at least, of board game communities like is. It's like it's a way to be with your friends doing something fun. So I feel like that pretty well establishes like who we are, how we got to know each other. One thing we haven't talked about is video games. So Chris, you, I think, probably kind of started your gaming adventure like with video games,
Definitely
right?
did. Yeah. So I've always been a gamer. And I think like most people, unless you're a little bit older, you've been in the hobby for longer, probably started on video games.
Right.
And I want to preface by saying I still like video games. It's not like I've totally drifted away from them, but I certainly don't play them like I used to because board games have kind of taken over. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's a little bit more superior of a hobby. Nothing against video games, but for me personally, I like them better. So it's funny, when you're like, I have a hard time remembering things from when I was like age 10 and younger. It's just all very hazy. Right. For me personally, I just have a hard time remember that. Little things here and there pop out. But what's interesting is I absolutely remember the first time I saw a video game. It is clear in my mind because it had such an impression on me. So I was probably around 5 or 6 years old based on the game. So I went over to my cousin Lori's house pretty early in the morning. And in the downstairs of her house, she had a gaming system, and she had just gotten a Nintendo NES, okay? And she was playing Super Mario Brothers 2. I remember it vividly. She was fighting that little crab boss that, like, throws the stones at you, and you have to, like, pick them up and throw them back. And I remember just being, like, in awe of it. Like, I was just like, what is this? And so, of course, I was, like, wanting to play, and she wouldn't let me play. So she had her friend Wesley over there.
Classic first video game experience.
Exactly. I remember being so frustrated. I was like, I want to play. And, like, they wouldn't let me play, right? And so I remember I went home to my mom and was, like, just real upset about it. Like, they wouldn't let me play. I wanted to play this. And my mom...
Well, they literally never gave you a turn.
No, I never got to play, right? I was watching them. Yeah. And just remember just being totally mind blown if a 6-year-old can be mind blown by something. And my mom was an awesome mom, and she just was probably too good to me and gave me more than I deserved. But she got me a Nintendo.
All right.
And I started on that, and I was typical, like, late 80s, early 90s Nintendo nerd. I was all in. I had the Super Mario Brothers lunchbox, the thermos.
Oh, yeah.
I had the Nintendo cereal.
There was a Nintendo cereal?
There was a Nintendo cereal. Yeah, so
the
it's
only
interesting.
Nintendo consumable.
Yeah. It had like Mario and Zelda on the cover. I actually looked not long ago. You can actually buy this on eBay for like $300.
Oh, I'm sure.
They have them in like these plastic cases. And I guess you could eat the cereal if you wanted.
It can be a podcast experiment.
Yeah, it could be. I remember, but should you, right? Yeah. I remember it being quite good.
Maybe
but
it's a hidden
after
gem.
like 30 years, it's probably not good. But yeah, I mean, I was just totally in. Like Mega Man, Castlevania. I mean, I even wrote some of them down. I'm trying to remember all the games that were like the ones that really like had Contra. Stuff like that. I just loved it. I had the Nintendo Power magazine. I called the Nintendo Power hotline, which was a thing if you didn't know that. So if you got, there's another memory. This, if my mom's listening to this, because she probably is. I called Nintendo Power so much one month, I didn't realize that they billed you every time you did that. And my
this is
mom,
back when you had a landline.
Yeah, this was landline phone.
We're dating ourselves.
So and yeah. So I was getting stuck on a game. I can't remember what it is now, but I called like numerous times one month. And when I came downstairs, my mom was holding a bill. It's a $100 phone bill,
You had to pick
which
up
at
a lot
that
of
time
pine
was
cones
huge.
to pay it off.
My dad was pissed. I mean, he was so mad. I mean, that's just how I was. I was just video games all the time. Went all the way through N64, PlayStation, Xbox, all that stuff. And all the way up until now. Like I said, I still consider myself to be a video gamer. I've always been competitive like that. But around med school, well, probably even a little bit after that. That's when I was first exposed to games. But when I really moved here is when it really started shifting for me.
Yeah. Did you ever play video games, Jason?
I think for me, I don't know that I would consider myself to be a gamer per se, but I had the same experience with Nintendo growing up. I'm kind of a Nintendo fanboy. Have never really gotten into PlayStation or Xbox or any of those. We did not have a Nintendo growing up until much later, but I still remember the days of when you could go to Blockbuster and you could rent a Nintendo system. It came in like a foam padded bag.
Oh, the whole system.
The whole system.
Yeah,
We would bring the whole system home. And so we would go and that was like a splurge for the weekend. We would go and rent Super Mario Brothers 3. That was our addiction. But yeah, a lot of fond memories with the Nintendo system growing up. I had the original Game Boy. That was my main introduction into games, but have followed the Nintendo line, pretty strictly throughout my gaming hobby. But yeah, I'll play something occasionally these days.
Yeah. We bounce stuff off of each other.
Yeah. We have a Switch. The kids play it more than I do. Every once in a while I'll get my hands on it and I'll wipe it off, get all the peanut butter and jelly off of it, and then, get a couple hours to play. But that's kind of my background with it. I can definitely see the parallels between enjoying that and what drew me into board games.
Absolutely.
Great, for sure.
My history with board games was learning Settlers of Catan and Power Grid from college friends and then slowly transitioning over to getting deeper into the hobby. My wife always makes fun of me, but traditionally I never want to start at the beginning of anything. I jumped to the most difficult, hardest possible thing ever. So we went from Settlers of Catan, and I really started getting into it, and we went straight to Dominant Species. It was like it was the next game in the list for us. after we kind of toned it down a little bit and I discovered the wide array of board games that are out there.
Hey, Jenny, let's play Dominant Species. Yeah.
That's probably how I scared her away from board gaming
Yeah.
forever. I don't know if she ever played that one with us, but if she did, that's the reason why she hates them now. So, yeah, that's me.
My background with video games is definitely it's similar, I think, to Chris, of like, going to a neighbor, going to a friend's house and seeing them like, oh, they have Super Mario Brothers, and wanting the NES, and then eventually we got one, I think, for Christmas or something like that. But just sticking with those systems, and I honestly really don't remember, other than maybe the Mario titles and maybe like Kirby, many NES titles on that system. We did the Sega, and really what I remember in my sort of video game like history is spending a lot of time playing Pokemon. Man, when in middle school,
Nerd.
Yeah, for me, man, middle school, I could name all 151 back when there were only 151 Pokemon, and that we played a lot of RPGs, like the Final Fantasy titles. Mm-hmm. And speaking of hidden gems, one of I think the most underrated RPGs on PlayStation, Legend of Dragoon. You guys might not even remember that title. I invested so many hours in that game, and it's so good. The system was so different from the sort of just click your attack and click your spell and it just goes and whatever. You had to link your attacks together by clicking the button right when this like outer square met this inner square, and if you didn't do it, then like your attack didn't do as much. That made a big impact on me for some reason. It was like, oh, like here I have to pay attention. I have to have some skill when I play this particular RPG. I really liked that. I think that maybe indicates kind of the beginning of my enjoyment of like games with some nuance to them that other games just didn't have, right? Mega Man, like all of those types of games,
the
like
best.
that was my
Best
that was my
NES
stuff.
game.
Platformers, and like really platformers are probably my favorite like video games. The most recent favorite game that I've played, bar none, is Hollow Knight. This isn't a video game podcast.
Love it.
Hollow Knight is incredible.
Top 5 all time for me.
Fantastic game.
Absolutely love it. I listen to, so one of the things I do when I'm writing code for work, I don't listen to music that has lyrics. Hollow Knight soundtrack,
amazing,
so good. Chris Larkin's music is incredible, and that's actually another thing that I really love about things like video games, the creativity that goes into, and really board games too. And like I think we'll talk about this. Like this is kind of my point of emphasis, I think, in terms of my contribution to this podcast. Is like I love the artwork that and the artistry that people put into the creation of their games, whether it's video games and it's the music or it's the art. I mean, Hollow Knight, for that matter, speaking of art, like tells the story through the art. It doesn't tell you the story on the nose. Like you don't get it through the dialogue
opaque, actually.
and the written things in the game. You have to kind of like study the background art.
Yeah.
And for me, like when I look at board games, like one of the first things I'm trying to do, and you know this because you were explaining rules, and we'll talk about this more when we get into the
this
actual
is your thing.
Game reviews. It's like I'm always trying to figure out the link between like, okay, how do I get from the concept of this game to the rules of this game? I love discovering the link between those two. And for me, to the extent to which a game does that well, I'm more inclined to give it a better review.
Yep.
And Chris, I'm always interrupting Chris when he's explaining rules, which, by the way, if you're listening to this podcast still for some reason,
if you stuck with us this long,
we've talked for a long time. Chris is the best rules explainer that I've ever experienced for board games. He can teach you a game so concisely, you get it the first time, you understand it completely. He's just fantastic at teaching games, and my hope is
totally going to blow it in episode 1.
My hope is
that
you're
guaranteed. Mark it down. It's going to be a train wreck.
That's right. My hope is that you're going to get to experience that when we review some of these games. We won't be doing full instructional videos or podcast
summary.
things. But we're going to go over rules for the games that we review, and Chris is just fantastic about that. I've always appreciated that about his ability. Probably comes from him being an instructor of doctors and med school at times.
Molding the future doctors of America.
That's right. But so I think that kind of wraps up video games.
Yeah. Before we transition off, though, I'm putting Jason on the spot here a little bit because I like what you did.
Okay.
Oh,
Do you? So I know what I would say. I'll let you think about it while I answer. But hidden gem video games, I like that
Okay.
because you said Legend of Dragoon.
Sure.
So
Sure.
for me, I think two really underappreciated games are older. Okay, but if you're older and you enjoy old school games, Star Tropics for the Nintendo
Okay.
is an awesome game. Still, I played it not long ago and it holds up. And then ActRaiser for the Super Nintendo, it was way ahead of its time,
Okay.
which is why it probably didn't do well. But it's kind of got a cult following
I've
as
never
well.
heard of that one.
It's amazing.
I've heard of Star Tropics, but I've never played
It's
it.
kind of like Sim City in that you're building these little cities that get
Okay.
attacked by like demons, almost like a natural disaster. But then you go down into the world and it's a 2D side scroller, like hacker, like with platforming.
Okay.
And it's hard,
Okay.
difficult.
Yeah.
I like hard video games.
Yeah.
This is why I like the older ones because they're brutal
Yes.
and they're difficult. I let the kids play Mega Man like a few months ago, and I just laughed with glee as they died
So
over
hard.
and over
They
again.
require you to memorize and
Yeah.
time everything.
Pattern recognition, memory. I mean, they were just getting slayed, and they love games, and they're good at games, and it was awesome. Then I just had to show them how it was done,
That's right.
of course. But yeah, for me, those for sure.
yeah, you put me on the spot.
I did.
I didn't have time to think about this. I don't know if I have one off the top of my head. I've played so many fantastic games over the years, whether it's Ocarina of Time or
Classic.
GoldenEye, the traditional, well-known, great games. Yeah, I'll have to think about it. I'll bring it up in a future
All right.
episode.
Sure, yeah.
But I don't think I have one that comes to mind like right off the top of my head. I will say, game that I've played recently that I've really enjoyed was Hades.
Yeah, you've been all about
it's
that
got-
lately.
It's
yeah.
gotten a lot of press, so it's definitely not hidden by any means. But really enjoyed going through that one.
Yeah.
Still need to play that.
Well, let's consider briefly our last topic, which is expectations for the podcast. We've got listeners that they're curious. They've listened to us. They know who we are now. What are our expectations for this podcast?
Yeah. So, and I'll answer briefly here because I know we are running long, but I think this is a good way to round it out. Obviously, I'd like to think that our podcast is a little bit unique in its approach of trying to like mine Board Game Geek or whatever, resource you use to look for games or to play games. And I would really consider this podcast to be a success if we were just able to create a community of gamers who are like-minded, who really want to try to find these kind of rare, undiscovered hidden gems that don't get enough play, that deserve more love. And, whether it be in like a BGG Guild or on any of our social media platforms, being like, hey, check this game out. This is a great game. And then all of these members just, sharing games with each other
Sure.
and with us that we might feature on podcast episodes, right? And just kind of create a community that way. I have no aspirations of making money off of this or this replacing my job or anything like that. I like my job, but for me, that would be like the ultimate goal.
For sure. Yeah, I think I would echo that. I think just getting exposure to these games, it's the thrill of the hunt, right? For me,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
just going after these types of games and really seeking them out and finding that hidden gem, there's such a thrill to that. I think it would be amazing if we somehow managed to get one of these amazing games reprinted, right?
Yeah.
Just from getting enough momentum behind it from folks who are interested, right? Obviously, that's a kind of pie in the sky dream. It's not an expectation from the
Nothing wrong with
podcast,
that.
but at the same time, I think it's something that we mutually enjoy, and hopefully, folks listening to this will enjoy the adventure as well.
Yeah, for me, just in the play testing that we've done in preparing for the first several episodes, I get to play all these new games that probably I wouldn't if we weren't actively trying to find games that kind of fall into these specific categories. We're playing some pretty good games. I mean, I know I'm tipping my hand here.
Foreshadowing.
I know that we're kind of supposed to keep our feelings to ourselves, but I've really enjoyed the playtesting of these games that I've never seen before. One of the things that I always pick on you about, Chris, is like, hey, Chris, have you ever played that game? Have you ever played that game? These are games that are on Chris's shelf. Chris is a great collector. It's an awesome collection. And we're getting an opportunity to dig into some of that and find
finally.
out whether or not these games are as good as they seemed when Chris snagged them.
Yeah.
Because I know your strategy is not like you don't just go buy the retail version of the game. You're picking up games opportunity. You're going to conventions, you're going to stores, and you're just kind of picking them up because they seem fine, and you haven't even read the rules or studied them very much.
Or
right?
I at least heard that they were fine. So because I do consume a lot of board game media, most of these games, the reason I knew about them or purchased them, I have at least heard about it at some point somewhere. But most of these games, for them really to be podcast worthy, it was usually just like a brief like mention. I'll just go ahead and say I'll probably reference the Dice Tower a lot on here. So that's a board game podcast, which is a great one. It's probably considered to be the gold standard. And I listen to them daily, and they've done top 10 lists over the years. And if they make mention of a game that's good, I'll write it down. I'll make a note of it. And so I have like a list of games that I just know about from listening to them. And so I just remember it. I'm like, I remember he talked about that game like years ago. Mm-hmm. And if I see it, I get it. And so I have a horrible shelf of shame. It's bad. Talia, I'm sorry. But if anybody ever asks me what percentage of these games I've played, I'm probably lying by at least 20%. Just because of the shame that I feel. If I were to answer honestly, it's bad, okay? I have kind of an addictive personality in that way, but I kind of feel like we have like a library now that we just all enjoy and share, which to me, that's happier. I would rather do that than have like a boat. Right, or like an RV or something. Like, that's what I enjoy.
But the real, like, satisfaction, though, that comes from that is when we pull one of these out and we play test it. We play it, like, multiple times, and we still think, it's a good game.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah. Which is the goal, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because it
doesn't have to be well known to be fun.
I think this is probably my favorite expectation of this podcast, which is, like, I love hanging out with you guys. And because we're like doing a podcast,
I know what you're going to say.
Like, we get to hang out even more. Yeah. Like, we have a reason to be like, hey, well, we got to go play test, you know?
That's
like,
right.
It's for the podcast, babe. You know? And she's like, all right, see you later. Like,
I was going to say that if you didn't. Yeah,
yeah, we have a reason now.
And it's for the podcast.
And I think
that's right.
We have to mention, too, how amazing are our wives?
Oh, my gosh.
They have been, at least to my knowledge, so supportive of this endeavor. All the research, all the planning, all the game nights, right? Thanks, ladies.
Talia.
I'll get made fun of plenty, but
we
the supportiveness is definitely there.
Love you. We wouldn't be doing this if we didn't have your support.
They're incredibly understanding of the amount of time they're willing to let us, even before the podcast.
That's right.
But even more so now, letting us do this for sure. And it's awesome to have the support. I have to say, Talia is like all in on this. She listens to these like influencers and stuff on social media. She loves it. She thinks it's awesome. So she thinks that we're going to be board game influencers now or something. So she's like all into it.
Maybe. We'll see.
She's on board.
Well, thank you guys for listening to us. We really appreciate you checking out this episode that's all about us. We hope that you'll continue to check out episodes with our game reviews. If you want to follow us on our social media platforms, be sure to do that. We would really appreciate it if you'd give us a review on iTunes or SoundCloud, wherever you listen to podcasts. Just give us a 5-star review. That would just really help us out, really help us to get the word out about the podcast and get us more listeners. That would just be super awesome of you. Hope you guys will check us out next time. I'm your host, Cameron.
This is Chris.
I'm Jason.
Thank you guys for listening. This episode of Hidden Gems, number 0, was recorded in Raleigh, North Carolina on January 31, 2021. If you like what you heard today, please consider giving episode 1 a listen as we talk about a hand-picked trio of unusual and underappreciated board games in our pilot episode. Hidden Gems is produced and edited by Chris Alley, Cameron Lockey, and Jason Yanchuleff. Our show's logo was illustrated by designer and artist Caitlin Nieto. Check out her work on Instagram at It's Caitlin Nieto. We would love to hear from you. Feel free to join the discussion on our many social media accounts. You can find us on Facebook at Hidden Gems Board Game Podcast, Instagram at hiddengems.podcast, and Twitter at Hidden Gems Board. Once again, thank you for joining us on Hidden Gems. And until next time, fellow gem seekers, enjoy your games and enjoy your search.